Hello, this is Thomas, K4SWL. If you're new here, I normally do real-time, real-life amateur radio field activation videos. But on occasion, I break that format and do sessions like this, which I like to call a hike and talk session. Though, admittedly today, I'm not wearing my hiking boots. I've got kind of street shoes on, so I'm not going to take the trail the whole time. I'll probably take a road, so maybe I should just be calling this the walk and talk session. But I'm planning to do a park activation here in just a little bit, but I wanted to stretch my legs before I did it. And I've got a topic on my mind I wanted to discuss. So I thought this would be a good time to do it. I've done a few of these hike and talk sessions in the past. And basically, this is just an opportunity for me to explore topics that are difficult to explore through an email response, a comment response, and sometimes even articles. They're usually topics that are kind of more dependent on context and things. So typical thing is like a really quick and easy question that has a very long answer. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today, actually. It's a topic I didn't even really know what to call it, other than how I decide when I use best practices. So by best practices, I mean sort of your textbook, best practice way of doing something. Especially when it comes to, say, antennas and parts of your field radio kit or your radio system designed around getting the maximum amount of efficiency out of your equipment. That sort of best practice or textbook case. Because I often get a lot of questions about why I do what I do. And a lot of my choices are based around the fact that I'm a field radio operator. So how I deploy my equipment in the field may be different than how I set it up in other places. So I thought maybe we kind of talk about this topic, keeping in mind that my hike and talk sessions, very much like my field activation videos, they're completely unscripted. I've had this topic sort of floating around in my head for a bit, but I don't have an outline. It's just you and me and the trail. And so I'll probably forget some important points and topics. So it's okay to comment in the comment section, maybe to fill in the blanks for me. If I miss something, bring up any other salient points, feel free to do so. So first of all, let's talk about what do I mean by best practices. Let's say, and this is going to be one of a few different scales I show you here probably. Let's say we have a scale. And at the top of the scale are best practices or textbook cases, doing something by the book the way it should be done properly. At the bottom of the scale, we don't have poor practices. Never do poor practices. Or bad practices. Now, at the bottom of this scale really is what we should call compromised, inefficient, but sound amateur radio practices. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with these practices. They're just not as efficient as a best practice. Again, in terms of overall sort of equipment performance, it's really what we're talking about today. So, being a field operator and one who posts his videos and field reports out there for everybody to read and watch, I get some scrutiny from people who want to comment about, how I set things up. I really have no issue with that at all. And in fact, I think that most of the people who comment genuinely want to enlighten me about how I set up, make suggestions, and that sort of thing. And I actually appreciate that. I would never want them to stop. I really enjoy getting feedback. I take it very constructively, and I've learned a lot of things from readers who've reached out and made comments and suggestions in the past. Sometimes I gotta admit, I think especially, and we'll be talking a lot about antennas here, because antennas are really, I get a lot of questions. But, I'll get someone who's really kind of, their thing is like engineering antennas and designing antennas and testing antennas. So when they see me deploy a little field antenna that's like maybe a couple of wires, a couple of 28.5-foot wires, I'm gonna get a lot of comments from them about that, because they know it's not an efficient antenna. And then often I get questions from people. In fact, I got a question recently that really kind of prompted me to even make this I Can Talk session video from someone who's a newly minted amateur radio operator. And as with getting a license in pretty much any country, a lot of the license material focuses on best practices, and it should focus on that. We need to know our best practices in order to know how to properly do something. You want to achieve and study what's the best, right? The best textbook way of doing something. It would make sense for the license materials to have, to be filled with compromised practices for everything, right? Then you would know what you should aim for when you want to do your best. So what I'd like to talk about now is me personally, how I make a decision of when I use a best practice and when I use compromised practices or inefficient practices. Again, in terms of performance of the system, not necessarily in terms of performance of what I'm doing. So let's start with yet another kind of scale here. If you can imagine, again, if you know me, these things, I don't edit these videos or anything, so I'm not going to have any fancy graphics. Just imagine that at the top of this next scale, we'll call this the Permanence scale. Okay, at the top of the scale, we have permanent installations of radio gear. At the bottom of the scale, we have temporary installations of radio gear. Now, I tend to use best practices when I'm going for a permanent situation. I tend to use compromise practices when I'm in a temporary situation. So let's discuss what a good example of a permanent situation would be. Basically, that would be, I think the most common thing for all of us, is our home QTH location, where we set up our main station, our main shack at our house. That is a permanent installation. In those situations, that's where I'm going to deploy my antenna, my radio system, my grounding system, and everything. I'm going to use those best practices to do it. I'm going to look to my textbooks, my antenna handbooks, the ARRL handbook, whatever it is I have on hand, and that's where I'm going to build out my system to use as many best practices as I can reasonably accommodate. Now, we can't always do that. And in fact, in terms of best practices, you'll see probably by the end of this I Can Talk session that just using the word best practice, that really is still, that's a contextually sensitive thing. Because one person's best practice may not be someone else's best practice. So for example, if you're home QTH, if you live on 100 acres of land with no restrictions, then you can put up any kind of antenna system you want to, any kind of radio system you want to, if you have the money to do it and the resources to do it. If you live in a small, let's say you're in sort of a terraced house in eastern half of London, a really high density neighborhood, and you've got a little small garden spot behind your house, and you really can't erect any kind of major antennas there, then a best practice for you might be installing sort of a really, really good amplified receive loop antenna along with a separate transmit antenna, maybe a vertical or something like that. That might make the most sense for you. It might be the best practice for that particular situation. But let's just suffice it to say, when you're putting a permanent radio station in your home, you want to use as many best practices as you can because you want to keep using it for a while and you want it to last as long as possible. Now, on the temporary side of things, I think a good example, because I just did one yesterday, is a Summits on the Air activation. SOTA activations are very temporary, especially for me. Now, even my Parks on the Air and Worldwide Flora and Fauna and everything else, all those other installations or deployments are also very temporary for me. But especially Summits on the Air, because usually when I do a SOTA activation, I tend to hike a good hour or more, sometimes 2 hours. Like yesterday, I think it was an hour and a half up to the site and an hour and a half back or something. When I get there, usually the maximum amount of time I'm going to be on the air is 1 hour. So my antenna installation is going to be a compromised one. I'm not going to, in that particular situation, I'm not going to deploy some elaborate antenna system, because in that temporary situation, what's more important to me than antenna efficiency, and we'll get into that in a little bit, is how quickly I can deploy the antenna and how quickly I can pack it up. Because I may only have a total of 1 hour on that summit. And so I don't want to take more than 5 minutes to get my antenna in a tree or on a mast or something like that. And I want 5 minutes to pack it up. Maybe not even that much. Someone reached out to me, probably 2 or 3 months ago. And they viewed a SOTA activation I did a year or two ago, I can't remember now, where I deployed a vertical antenna with one counterpoise on a summit. And I got this really long email that was very informative, but telling me about how that antenna system I deployed simply did not work. It's just too inefficient. And I'm guessing that they didn't actually look at the activation, because the activation was wildly successful. Massive pileup the entire time I was on the air. So I was a little surprised that that's what he was looking at. But I could tell that he's an engineer that really likes to focus on antennas. I could also tell he probably doesn't operate in the field a lot. He had suggested that if I use a vertical antenna like I had, I really needed a minimum of 64 ground radials for the conditions where I was using the antenna, basically in an area with poor soil conductivity and that sort of thing. And in a way, he's right. At my house, which has similar conditions, if I were to deploy a 20-meter vertical, I would either use probably 4 elevated radials or at least 64 ground radials, maybe 128 if I had enough wire and enough time. You really do want a lot, the more the merrier. But when I'm doing a SOTA activation, it's just not practical to deploy 124, 64, or even 32 ground radials. It's maybe practical to deploy 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6, because it takes so much time to deploy them. And sort of another example is, I'll turn around here and head back, start my activation. I'm running a long time. Another example would be at home. I use a lot of RF grounding, like I RF ground my station. I don't do that in the field. I don't really need to do it in the field. There's not a lot of noise, not a lot of reason at QRP power doing HF that I need to do any kind of RF ground, of course. Again, big difference between permanent installation and a temporary installation. So let's talk about another scale. This one I'll call the competition scale. So at the top, we have a very competitive environment. At the bottom, we have no competition. So between no competition and a lot of competition. When I'm in a situation with a lot of competition, then I want to use my best practices. When I have no competition, I don't need to use those best practices as much. I can get away with less efficient practices. So here are some examples of what I mean. I think the best example I can think of for a highly competitive environment would be a de-expedition, trying to reach a de-expedition. So let's say you're a de-exer. That's a better way to put it. You're not the de-expedition. You're the chaser of a de-expedition. You're the de-exer. So that is a highly competitive environment. Now, why? Well, for one thing, when you're trying to chase that de-expedition, you're one of many other signals trying to chase it. So that RF environment is very competitive. You need to deploy the best antenna you can, that's highest gain, and that's directional, so that you can direct it to your DX target to make the most of the power that you're using. A lot of DXers would argue too that you need to be able to have access to full legal limit in terms of power. That may be a best practice among DXers, right? Because the more signal, the sort of the focus of your effort is to direct that all of your signals energy, all of your energy toward that DX so they can hear you and you can hear them. I would think about the Bouvet Island de-expedition that happened in February of this year. Super, super competitive environment. Probably one of the most competitive de-expeditions in terms of hunting them of any de-expedition I remember. And I've tried to snag a lot of a de-expedition. I've successfully snagged lots of de-expeditions. But I didn't snag them. The reason why is they got there, and Bouvet is a very inhospitable place. They had really bad weather, and frankly, just didn't work out the way they wanted it to. So they were on the air 10 days only with 2 stations at 100 watts, and that was it, with non-directional antennas. So people who successfully hunted them had pretty good benchmark stations, especially if they weren't in an easy sort of propagation footprint of Bouvet. There's a lot of DQRM and all kinds of stuff going on in that particular de-expedition, but it was super highly competitive. Now, on the opposite end of that scale, we'll go back to being a summit activator. When you're a summit activator, you're not in a competitive environment. In fact, in theory, there should be no competition at all because you are the DX. Same thing if you're a park activator or an island activator or a special event station, something like that. You're the DX. You are the station people are chasing and hunting. So you're on the other end of that. I guess you could say the de-expeditioners of Bouvet had a non-competitive environment. That would be a tricky one to answer though, because they actually did, in a sense, have a competitive environment based on where they were geographically. It was not an easy place. So it's not a fair comparison there. But when you're activating a park or you're activating a summit, the stations come to you. In that environment, my little vertical with one counterpoise works brilliantly because I get big pileups when I'm activating a summit. Other summit activators do too, if the conditions are just even reasonable and you're not activating at some really oddball hour or something. You're going to get pileups, or at least lots of stations calling you. In fact, I've often told people, I think I could just take a coat hanger with me. If I could tune it and just get a decent match, I can probably activate that summit very easily, because I'm the summit activator, I'm the DX. There's no competition for me unless there's someone else on the frequency with me, in which case I just move. A huge difference. This is really kind of the key why when people tell me that I should always deploy my end-fed halfways with a dedicated counterpoise, elevated, that's resonant on certain bands and that sort of thing, why I should deploy, a horizontal dipole, why I should deploy other antennas that may just take a lot longer to deploy. It's just not needed at all. Right now, as it is, most of us POTA and SOTA activators, we have more signals than we can handle in the time that we have on the air, especially if we have a limited amount of time. Today, for example, I'll maybe have a 30-minute window to do an activation. I guarantee you, when I hop off the air, there'll still be stations calling me. If I put up a more efficient antenna, it has no real meaningful impact to me. It's just a big difference. Now, it's not everything's so black and white, right? So sometimes you have things, situations that are semi-permanent and semi-competitive. Or maybe they're fairly permanent and fairly competitive. For example, field day. If you are doing a field day event with a club, you tend to use best practices because you're going to be on the air probably 24 hours. You may have multiple stations on the air at the same time. So you really need to use bandpass filters, possibly grounding and bonding, possibly. I know a lot of stations that do, a lot of clubs that do. You're going to deploy your antennas so that they are not directing their signals at each other, right? So you have to think about how you deploy your antennas in your antenna field. It's just more complicated and more complex and a more competitive environment because the RF density of being both a caller and a hunter or a hunt and pounce person during field day, that's a more competitive situation than just some random contacts. You're both the DX and you're the hunter in most cases, unless you're doing some kind of blowtorch station, which you can just call CQ the entire event, I guess, and not hunt and pounce. So, that's a situation where you'll have to decide, how far do I do best practices? And it tends to be, and I think it's a very good thing, that clubs, when they do field day deployments, lean to the side of best practices. I think that makes a lot of sense. Of course, there's some other factors in there. For example, if you live in a spot, in a place of the world where you're not geographically connected to lots and lots of other amateur radio operators in your normal propagation footprints. For example, Hawaii is an example I like to use. Possibly Alaska, maybe South Africa. There are lots of parts of the world that are like this, that are sort of geographically isolated. Not necessarily in that there aren't populations around them, but there aren't a lot of ham radio populations around them. The density is much less. Here, I live in the eastern part of the U.S. In the United States, probably the majority of all amateur radio operators are within my 40-meter footprint and 30-meter footprint. So when I do a park activation here, it's pretty darn easy to snag that activation, get my 10 contacts. But if you're activating in Hawaii and you're using QRP power, you're probably going to have to lean toward the best practices side of things for your antennas. Or you need to use more power. You know, you'll have to have some kind of compensating factor there when you're in a situation like that. In addition, I know people who live in DX spots. So let's say that you lived on St. Helena, the island, or St. Helena, I guess some people call it, in the South Atlantic. Very isolated too geographically. Lots of people would like to work you where you are. And so every time you hop on the air, if you're putting a signal out and people can hear it, you're probably going to get a little pileup because you'll get spotted as being an operator from St. Helena. Or let's say you're in the Faroe Islands or something like that. Just a place where there aren't just loads and loads of other amateur radio operators. Maybe the island of Svalbard, something like that. Probably every time you hop on the air, you're going to have a little mini pileup. So in a way, you're in a non-competitive situation. But since every time you hop on the air, you're going to be met with lots and lots of other signals, you might decide to use more best practices with your station so you can select where your signal's going. So for example, if you're getting just loads and loads and loads of European stations all the time, but you really want to work South America or Asia, some Southeast Asia or someplace, then you need to think about your antenna system and using best practices to achieve your goal. So I think I've probably covered most of the things that are kind of floating around my head about this. Basically, I guess if I've got one takeaway, I think that best practices are always the goal, right? But knowing that there are also practices that are sound amateur radio practices and principles that are less efficient, but perhaps just as effective as a best practice. And it's okay to use them. You can use them anytime you want to. And I think if I had a sort of a negative connotation with best practices, it's this. I get lots of inquiries from new amateur radio operators. And they just got licensed. They've been reading about all these best practices. And sometimes they're afraid to hop on the air because they just feel like their station isn't at that benchmark that it needs to be. Yet they have all the components. Or maybe they want like the best possible antenna, but it's going to set them back $2,000 for something, more benchmark. What I always tell them is, let's find a way that you can do this by building something simple, hopping on the air, and yeah, maybe you don't have the performance you would have with that higher end antenna, but you'll be able to enjoy being on the air. I'm almost back to my car, so I'll do a quick little loop right here. Don't let a best practice stop you from getting on the air. Just use good practices. Maybe it's not efficient, I know some people who have mobility issues and that sort of thing, and actually they're visually impaired. And so they use portable antennas when they go out to the field that are very compromised. However, it doesn't require them leaning on anyone else for help to do the deployment. And in that situation, that's a best practice for them to go out and just hop on the air. And that makes a lot of sense. It's contextually sensitive. It really is. It all depends. So, again, just keep in mind that what you need to do when you're starting out is really latch on to someone with some experience. Have them help you set up your first amateur radio station in the field or in the shack or wherever, and use some of their guidance to make sure you're doing things that are sound principles. So your transceiver's happy, your antenna's happy, that you're going to make some contacts and get on the air and get some experience instead of just waiting around until things are just perfect. In fact, I think that's one of the things I like to tell people the most about field operating. Use what you got. I review lots of radios and test lots of radios, and I'm very, very fortunate that I get to do this. Very fortunate. Haven't always been in that situation when I first started out, especially. But I don't want it to ever look like you have to have this radio, this antenna in order to go have fun in the field. You can get away with something very modest. You can use the radio that you have. Some of my first field radios were full tabletop radios that required like an amp of receive current and were super inefficient, but I had a blast with them. You can have a blast with any radio that can put out a good clean signal that you can hook up to an antenna. You're going to have fun. So I think that's really the main reason why I'm mentioning any of this in this I Can Talk session. Anyway, thank you so very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I know this is probably a little long and rambly for some people, but I enjoy these sessions with you because it gives me a chance to kind of talk things out a little bit. Again, I'll probably forget some really important points. It's perfectly fine to comment on the blog, comment on YouTube, wherever, and make your suggestions and your comments. I would very much welcome that, because I'm sure I've forgotten some other really good points here. But anyway, and I'd like to thank anyone who's supporting me on Patreon or the Coffee Fund. I really appreciate that. It makes a huge difference to me and allows me to produce more videos and more field reports because it frees up my time. I'd otherwise be doing other things to make money. And as I've mentioned before, all of the funds that I don't use for running the site and buying equipment and doing all that other stuff, that all goes into my family's fund money for traveling and that sort of thing, which also usually opens the door to even more activations and things. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the support. It's really humbling, to be honest. Very humbling. Anyway, I hope you get out there, get to play a little radio. If you're new, try to find a local club or someone who can help you out. If you know of someone who's new and would like to get into the world of amateur radio, either in the field or at home or whatever, reach out and give them a helping hand. We really do rely on the ambassadors, the Elmers, the mentors in our radio world in order to really hop in there and hop on the air. You can really make a big difference in someone's life when you spend a little time with them, maybe help them deploy their antenna at home or go with them on a POTA or SOTA activation, and you'll probably make a good friend in the process. Thank you so much for joining me today, and take care of yourselves, be kind to one another, and until next time, 7 3s.